I'm Edmund Trueman. I'm going to talk. Yeah, well, I feel like this issue of World War III now, one of the big themes was collaboration between artists of different countries and collaboration between people across borders. And I wanted to do a little talk about some projects which have happened, which have created artistic collaborations between Congo and the rest of the world, and sort of give that as an example for all of us of how we could collaborate with people on the other side of the world, especially in a way that we can sort of share the privileges we have in some part of the world with parts of the world that don't have those privileges. Um, so who am I? I'm Edmund Trueman. I wrote this book, Postcards from Congo. It's like a graphic novel about the history of Congo. That's how I got really interested in the history of Congo and the culture. And while I was doing the research for this book, um, I ended up learning a lot about the culture, about a lot of comic artists, and eventually that journey led me to the country where I met a lot of the artists whose work I'm going to show you because I want you to see some of the great stuff that's going on there at the moment. Before I show you their work, I just want to talk quickly about some of the challenges that the artists in Congo are facing, um, which aren't unique to Congo. There's a lot of countries in the world who face those challenges, a lot of artists who are facing those challenges, but I think it's worth considering them because they are different to the challenges we might have in our own countries. Congo is often listed as one of the poorest countries of the world. There's a conflict in the eastern corner of the country. That conflict doesn't really reach most of the country, but poverty, poor infrastructure, government corruption really plagues the daily life of people. Unemployment is insanely high. 80% of the economy is informal, so that's mostly people selling stuff by the roadside, vegetables, secondhand electronics, bread, sort of like really precarious work. The obstacles specific to comic artists are things like there's no domestic publishing house at all. If you want to get your work published, you've just got to do it yourself. There's no domestic printing press, by which I mean there is no there's no printers in Congo which can produce a book or a fanzine of the quality of anything that you would find in your local comic store. And I think you can imagine how much of an obstacle that is to sort of keep a scene going and keep an arts movement going if you don't even have the means of production in your country. Another obstacle is there's no funding bodies in the Congo. It's an incredibly poor country. I know that in the States, I think you don't have government funding bodies, but you do have private arts funding. In Europe, some countries we have arts funding bodies, and a lot of artists rely on that. Um, the infrastructure of the country is very poor, which means that the internet is incredibly slow. If you think about how much we rely on social media today to promote our work and to connect with each other, even this call that we're doing right now would be really, really hard to do for most Congolese people because the internet just isn't fast enough to do it. And power cuts are very commonplace in Congo. And I'm talking about city life. In the countryside, most villages don't even have electricity. In the city, every day you're probably going to have at least 2 or 3 hours on average where the power just cuts out. And people who are listening who are comic artists, you'll know that as a comic artist, especially when you're starting out, a lot of your work is in those early hours in the morning before anyone else has got up, before you've got to go to work, or those late hours in the evening when everyone else has gone to sleep. That's when you're getting your work done a lot of the time, especially when you're starting out and you've got a sort of a 9 to 5 job. Well, imagine you're trying to do that and the light's gone, and I don't, either you go carry on with candlelight or that's it. So those are some of the obstacles the artists are facing. And I'm not trying to create like a sob story picture of Congo, but more I'm trying to show how it's all the more impressive the artwork that people are creating because they're overcoming those obstacles. So I want to show you a few Congolese artists. This is the work of Yan Kombozi. He's one of the sort of really talented guys of the younger generation. Um, Beautiful line work. You can see that there's a little bit of like a manga influence in the faces, and he's doing sort of slice of life stories about the daily lives of people in Kinshasa, the capital city of Congo. with a bit of adventure to keep the reader interested. Jan's got his own indie publishing house. Now, I said that there's no printing press in Congo. He's subverted that by he's getting things printed in China and sent over. That's obviously way more expensive than the price that you or I are paying to get something printed in your local neighborhood copy shop. But, he's getting it done because that is the only way that he's managing to print sort of full color, nice fanzines. So he's playing a big role in keeping the comics alive at the moment in Congo with his work and printing other people's work. This is Judith Kaloaji. She's sort of like one of the rising stars of the Congolese comics at the moment. She writes about sort of the daily struggle of living as a woman in urban Congo at the moment, sort of the different challenges they have. It's autobio stuff, and I think there's a lot of autobio stuff out there, and it can get a bit navel-gazy sometimes. But for me personally, this is really interesting work because the cultural point of reference is so different to something I've lived myself. So I would definitely recommend checking her out. If you Google her name, you can find a lot of this stuff online. From the older generation, Asimba Bathi is one of the sort of big names. Asimba is not only a very talented artist, he's also known as one of the biggest promoters of Congolese comics outside of the country. I'll talk a bit more about his work doing that in a moment. This is a page from his work, Lumumba. It's a biopic about Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese liberation figure. So he's producing sort of French style graphic novels, like short albums of 30 pages. You can order those online. He's got dual residence in Belgium, so he's shipping stuff from Europe. Um, I'll talk a little bit more about his role in sort of maintaining the comics movement in a moment. If you're into something a bit more weird and arty and strange, this is the work of Papa Mfumetu le Premier. He's sort of the Congolese equivalent of the legend of underground comics, maybe a Congolese Robert Crumb, you might say. In the 90s and 2000s, Congo was going through really tough times. There was huge economic crisis at the end of the Mobutu dictatorship, and that led into what was known as the Congo Wars in the late 90s and early 2000s. So it was a war that sort of spread across the country. Against that background, Papa Mfumetu was a single father, and he managed to raise a child just by printing thousands of issues of this comic and selling them on the streets of Kinshasa. I said before that a lot of the economy is informal, and almost every street of Kinshasa, both sides of the street are lined by street vendors selling stuff. So he was printing thousands of these comics a week and sending them out, and they were being sold on street corners for the slice of a price of bread. You can see that this was printed in Congo, and you can see that it's a very lo-fi production. The ink is a slightly different color at the bottom of the page to the top of the page. And these are really weird stories to a Western reader. They're very wacky and like so the stories are based heavily on local beliefs of sort of sorcery and witchcraft, which are still very alive and present in the daily lives of Congolese society. And he's kind of mixing that with the urban gossip of the day. So perhaps, an urban legend is struck up on Monday about something which has happened in Kinshasa, and already on Sunday afternoon, he would have a comic circulating the streets, which is telling the story of it. So that was a really big movement in the sort of the 90s and the early noughties when the economy was just too weak for anything else to be really published, that he found a way to subvert that and keep producing work. And he was incredibly prolific. Now he's not making comics very often. He's working as a painter now. This is the work of Didier Kasai. He's not Congolese. He's from Central African Republic, which is a small neighboring country. But I wanted to share his work because I think he's one of the greatest comic artists alive today, and he's not as well known as he should be. That's a page from his comic Storm over Bangui, about when the rebels invaded his hometown, the capital city of Central African Republic. Beautiful watercolor, as you can see, and just like really powerful stories. So Didier is one of the lucky few who's managed to get a contract with a publisher abroad. His work is published by, I've forgotten the name of the publisher. He's published by a European publisher, so you can order that stuff and they'll definitely ship it to the States. Um, He's one of the lucky few because one of the other difficulties of not having a domestic publisher is that it's very hard for those artists to make a link with an international publisher. I think it's easy for us to take for granted. Me living in Europe, freedom of travel is very easy. In the United States, you've got an enormous country. There's loads of comic scenes all over it. But for Africans, it's very hard even to get a visa to visit a neighboring country, let alone to go to a European comic convention or an American comic convention where you might be able to meet people from the publishing industry. But through the virtue of his great work, Didier has managed that. But that's something that's a lot harder for those artists to achieve because publishing houses are just much further away for them. Um, so I wanted to show you a few of the big names of the Congolese comics, just so you get an idea of some of the great stuff that's going on there at the moment. And now I want to show you what was sort of the main focus of this talk was some projects in which artists from sort of the Western world or the global North managed to partner with Congolese artists and sort of like, yeah, just like use the privileges that are available to us in the global North and use that in a way that could benefit those artists. So this is a project called Kin Label. This was headed by Asimba Bathi, who I showed you earlier. I said that he was a big promoter of Congolese comics outside of the country. So Asimba he applied for funding through a Belgian funding body, and he used that funding to start up a comics publishing house and a regular magazine in Congo. That was it, I believe, in 2006, 2007, and it ran for 5 or 6 years, sort of publishing regular. He got the older generation of artists together with a lot of art students and kind of educated a new younger generation. Later on, they produced a few graphic novels. This is Paul Pandafarnana, Une vie oubliée. It's a biopic of Paul Pandafarnana, who was an early civil rights activist from Congo. So that's an example of one great thing that we can do is use the arts funding that we can apply for, that we are applicable to, and try and think of a way to bring that to African artists or artists in any other country that don't have those possibilities. Use their talent and get them a paid gig, which is much harder to get in their own countries. Share the privilege that we've got accessible to us. Similar story. This was a project called Popular Images, which was curated by an artist duo called Shelhammer Mukenge. It's a German Congolese couple. And they did an exhibition about Congolese comics in one of the big comics festivals in Germany, in Erlangen. They flew loads of artists over, exhibited their work. The work was auctioned off, so the artists were able to create that international exchange. They could sell work at a much higher price than they would be able to sell it domestically. And at the end of the project, they produced this website, Popular Images. Loads of great articles about Congolese comics. If you're interested in learning more about some of the people I'm talking about, I would definitely recommend checking out that website. I'll have a link to it at the end of the video. There's also great articles by Congolese art critic Jean Kamba. So that's another example of using the arts funding that we can apply for here in the global north and using that to benefit artists in countries who can't apply for it. Another thing that we can do to partner with artists in other countries is publish their work. I said a couple of times, there's no publishing houses in Congo. This is an example of L'Harmattan BD. It's a French publishing house. They publish loads of work by African artists. This is the cover of Jungle Urbain by Tembo Cash. He's another legend of the older generation of Congolese comics. So L'Harmattan BD, they publish loads of work by African artists, and it's a great way to get that talent seen by people all over the rest of the world. And once again, get a paid gig for artists in a country where it's very hard to support yourself as a comic artist. It's already hard to support yourself as a comic artist in the global north, so it's much harder when you're away from that. They're also reprinting older works. This is a work by Mongo-Sise. He was sort of the grandfather of the Congolese comics. He did an internship in Studio Hergé, where the Tintin stories were produced. And this is a reprint of one of his works. He passed away quite a few years ago, but his legacy is, in this way, his legacy is accessible to us in the rest of the world as well. Another example of what we can do to partner with artists in the global south, in Congo, is a collaboration, an artistic collaboration. And I'm not talking about something which is very popular now, for example, in the world of animation, that instead of paying a colorist in the same country as the studio, they will pay a colorist in India to work for $2 an hour at a terrible wage. I'm talking about projects where we work side by side with the artist. We each have equal creative input. We each benefit, financially from the project. We each get our work out there and create beautiful work together. So this is a book called House Without Windows. Didier Cassai, I showed you his work earlier. He collaborated with Scottish photographer Mark Ellison, and they've made it's sort of half photo comic, and then the action periodically jumps into illustrated comic. It's absolutely beautiful book. You can order it online. Um, Definitely give it a look, and just sort of about the difficulty of growing up in Central African Republic. Another example of collaboration. Here's a work in progress that I'm doing right now with Papa Mufumето Le Premier. That was the legend of Congolese underground comics that I mentioned earlier. So we're working on this at the moment. We're sort of writing it and drawing it together. And I just think this sort of like cross-cultural collaboration is a really beautiful way for us to learn about artists from another place and create something really new, with ideas that we never would have had alone. A final thing that I want to mention that we can do to support and partner with artists on the other sides of the world and create those bridges is just, social media. It's absolutely no effort. Do a post, do a story, whatever, about one of those artists that interests you from another side of the world, and people are going to find it, people are going to follow them. And I think, as we've seen from this event today, the more we can build bridges together as artists from other countries, then the further we can go. And we do help. It sounds cliche, but I think we do help to make the world a slightly nicer place when we build those bridges. So that's all I'm going to say for now. This is a list of all the artists that I mentioned. I'm going to leave it on screen for a moment. I would invite all of you to take a photo of the screen now so you can look those artists up later on social media, or if you're watching on the online link, take a screenshot. All of these people are on social media. A lot of African artists are more promoting their work on Facebook than Instagram, but please look them up, give them a follow, see what they're up to. And at the bottom there, you can see the website that I recommended, popularimages.org. If you want to learn more about Congolese comics, that's definitely the best place to start. You can access it in French, English, or German. So that's all I've got to say for now. I hope that gave you some ideas and inspired you a little bit of ways that you can partner with some artists in the other side of the world.